Hello everyone and welcome back to another modelled writing video. Today we are looking at two task 1 questions. So task 1 are the questions which you get 20 minutes and you are required to write a minimum of 150 words. So it's not a lot of words, but it's not a lot of time either. So we're going to look at how we go about planning those today, and then we will do the write-up as if we were in the exam itself. So if you have booked your IELTS exam, if you are practicing, if you're not sure how to tackle task 1 at all, then you are in the right place. We will go through all the tips and tricks for you today to get those top band scores. Okay, so let's have a think then about our first task, which is going to be a bar chart. So these are a common type of charts that come up in the exam, something to be aware of, familiar with. Yes, I would definitely practice bar charts and the language that we need to use for them. So let's have a look at the task. The chart below shows the places visited by different people living in Canada. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant as well. Right, so we're being told how to answer this question. They want us to select and report the main features, not every single feature. We just have to pick the main ones that are particularly striking or interesting or different, and make comparisons where relevant. So this is important because we don't want to make comparisons with every single part of the data. That is not what our job is. We are being asked to just make them when they are particularly interesting or striking or different. All right, so let's have a look at the context again. Places visited by different people living in Canada. Okay, let's have a look at the bar chart. Right, okay. So these different places then, we have our y-axes with them. Places like the cinema, theatre, library, zoo. And the different people we have in yellow, new migrants born in other countries. Okay. In blue, new migrants born in English-speaking countries, and the green referring to people born in Canada. So these different groups. And the percentage on the x-axis, 0 to 70%. So we can say that 70% of these groups have visited these types of places. Right, so initial thoughts then, the cinema is really high for visiting. All groups are visiting there very in high percentages. The theatre, on the other hand, oh, that's the lowest place in which people went to. The library, particularly visited by new migrants born in other countries. And the zoo, particularly visited by new migrants born in English-speaking countries. So those are some initial thoughts and ponderings. So now we can go to our plan. Okay, so we're tasked with grouping these together. We want logical groups that we can compare and contrast easily. Okay, so for this reason, we could do, there's no strict rule as to how to group. You could perhaps group 2 of these different groups together. So for example, you could group born in Canada and maybe new migrants born in English-speaking countries, and then new migrants born in other countries in another one, or however you like. Or you could group by places visited. For this, I think I'm going to go with places visited and do 2 in each group and then compare and contrast that way. So let's start then. The group that is very striking is not the group, the place is the cinema. So we could group that together with perhaps the library is also very high and the zoo is also very high. Let's go for maybe the library, similar sorts of pattern here. Because the zoo and the theatre have a similar sort of trend, as in people, new migrants born in English speaking countries are the highest in those two. So we can group the theatre and the zoo together. Okay, our overview then, we want to state a general sweeping statement about what's happening in this bar chart, but we don't want to be specific. So we could say something like a high percentage of every group frequented, which means went to the cinema. That's the most striking piece of information here. Whilst the theatre was the least visited. Okay, and these are just your notes, so you can, of course, you don't have to write in full sentences. You can scribble down your ideas there, and you'll have this in the exam, so you can refer back to this. That's no problem as well. Lovely. Okay, so we are grouping, we're thinking of ideas here. I think we can go to our question, and we will in the exam we'll have the task at the top. We can talk about, we can use these words here. These are quite nice to talk about different places and maybe the percentage increased or decreased, maybe that stayed the same. And when you combine these types of words, these verbs, with adverbs, this makes for a really nice sentence. So we'll have that there as a prompt. You won't have this in the exam, unfortunately, but that is here today to help us with synonyms and thinking of different ways to express ourselves, because we don't want to repeat ourselves. We're trying not to do that. That's part of the criteria for the top bands. Okay then, and of course we've got our data, our bar chart here. Right, so what are we going to do first? Of course, we are going to paraphrase, or in other words, write in our own words, this sentence here. Now, paraphrasing is a vital skill for IELTS, and it's incredibly important in achieving those top marks. Right, okay. The charts below. Okay, ooh, we have a different type. It's a bar chart, so we can say, can be more specific. The bar chart, the chart below shows, maybe illustrates or demonstrates the places visited. Are they all buildings, or the areas, or not so much the buildings, the illustrates parts of town, I like this word, frequented by different people living in Canada, various groups residing in Canada. It's hard to paraphrase Canada, and we don't want to lose the meaning. So it's very important to paraphrase as much as you can, but we want to stay accurate as well. Okay, so the bar chart illustrates the parts of town frequented by various groups residing in Canada. I think that's good. We've paraphrased as much as we can there. Righty-ho, so what do we do now? We want to open it up with our overview. So we've written it on our notes in note form so we can create a nice sentence now, a sentence or two. So a way to open this, we can say in general, on the whole, something like this. A high percentage of every group visited the cinema. Now, we're not going into specifics here. We want to leave that for the body, so we're just being very general. A high percentage of every group visited the cinema, whilst the theatre was a building which people went to the least. Let's read this back. In general, a high percentage of every group visited the cinema, whilst the theatre was a building which people went to the least. Okay, so that is our overview, just briefly drawing upon some main takeaways from this bar chart. Right, so now we can move into our first group, and that is going to talk about, we'll have our notes here, the cinema and the library. The cinema and the library. Okay, so we've mentioned the cinema. Let's get stuck in with this because that is a striking piece of information here, and we can draw upon the numbers. So maybe we can start it with a nice phrase like without a doubt. The cinema compared with other places was where most people went to. Okay, or the majority was where the majority of individuals went to. Okay, so now we can go into some detail here. 70% of Canadian-born residents had been, we have this line here, 70% of Canadian-born residents had been. And let's have a look. We have new migrants born in English-speaking countries are not far behind. Not far behind at 60, let's have a look, 65% was new migrants born in English, capital E, English-speaking countries. Okay, brilliant. So let's think about new migrants born in other countries now. Now 50% of them went to the cinema, but actually this wasn't the highest group for them. This was the highest place for them where they went the most. It was actually the library. So let's now put that into a nice sentence or two. However, even so, although new migrants born in other countries didn't attend no, new migrants born in other countries didn't attend film screenings, another word for cinema, film screenings the most. It was the library. And now let's draw upon the figure at 55%. Okay, now we have the other two groups for the library, and they are actually 40% and below. So we can put them together. We don't always have to state the percentage. We can just say new migrants born in English speaking English speaking countries and born in Canada groups stood at 40% and below for this we can say public service, maybe not public service, public for this. Let's have a read. Canada group stood at 40% and below for this public institution, maybe. Let's have a read back and then we'll think about it. Without a doubt, the cinema, compared with other places, was where the majority of individuals went to. 70% of Canadian-born residents had been. Not far behind at 65% was new migrants born in English-speaking countries. However, new migrants born in other countries didn't attend film screenings the most. It was the library at 55%. New migrants born in English-speaking countries and born in Canada groups stood at 40% and below for this public institution. Yes, let's change that. It doesn't sound quite so smooth. And below for this category. It'll just be general. There we go. Okay, I think that's good. We've compared the cinema and the library. So now we can talk about the theatre and the zoo, which have a similar well, the theatre scores the lowest for all groups, but it follows the same pattern in the zoo as in new migrants born in English-speaking countries score the highest in there. Okay, so let's jump into the theatre then. The theatre was the lowest, was the place, was the least visited place for all groups. And then we can pick on a percentage to draw from new migrants born in other countries. In particular, new migrants born in other, oh, we've got two spaces there, born in other countries. And then I like a bracket. Sometimes we can do 10%. Okay, lovely. Born in Canada group was 20%. In particular, new migrants born in other countries. Born in Canada, individuals People within the born in Canada group doubled that percentage. So we don't always need to be explicit. We can allude to different percentages and talk about them in different ways, which is quite nice. So 20%, instead of saying that, people within the Canada group, born in Canada group, doubled that percentage. So we know that it's 20%. Right, so let's talk about the zoo then. Let's wrap this up. All groups, all, or maybe percentages, rose for the zoo, and in fact followed the same pattern as the theatre. The theatre where new migrants, we want to talk about that 50% born in English speaking countries, held the highest percentage, 50%. Okay, let's read this back now and make sure it all sounds okay. The theatre was the least visited place for all groups, in particular new migrants born in other countries, 10%. People within the born in Canada group doubled that percentage. Percentages, percentage. Figures rose. Figures rose for the zoo and in fact follow the same pattern at the theatre as the theatre, where new migrants born in English-speaking countries held the highest number, 50%. Okay, so we've tried to compare and contrast where it's relevant. We've grouped them together in logical groups here. I think we've given that a really good go, this question. Okay, let's find out how many words this comes to. Alrighty, so that comes to 171 words, so slightly over the 150 word limit, a very reachable amount for you in the exam. And as long as we're hitting the 150, then that's the main thing there. But hopefully you can see how we structure the task one. We open up with the paraphrasing, we go into the overview, and then we talk about the two groups that we've made, and we draw upon the figures there to create a really nice report. Notice that we're not going into the reasons why. This is not asking for why we think certain things. We are just reporting on this, stating it back to the reader. So yes, that is an important point to note as well. All right, so we've used this structure and we're going to use it again in the next topic, which is going to be all about a line graph. So line graphs are, again, a popular type of task one that can come up. They can come up on their own. They could come up with other charts and graphs. So definitely something to be aware of for task one. All right, let's go to the question, the task. The graph below shows how elderly people in the United States spent their free time between 1980 and 2010. So it's past tense. Okay, good to know. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. All right, so like the last one, we're being told what to do. They want us to select and report the main features and make comparisons only where it is relevant. So we don't need to compare absolutely everything. No, don't worry about that. We just want to compare the main features here. Okay then, so let's have a think about this a bit more. Let's bring in the line graph. Right, okay, so on the x-axis we have the years, 1980s, 1990s, 2000, and the tens, which actually it ends with this, so it doesn't go into the tens, but it stops at the tens. So we've got essentially 3 decades: 80s, 90s, and noughties here. Right, and then on the y-axis we have the percentage. So how much of their free time is being spent in what capacity, and we've got the different ways. So for example, reading, hiking, watching TV, and of course the line graph shows how this changes over time. Okay, so initial thoughts then. We have this hiking line which does not falter, it stays in the same trajectory the whole time, increasing. Another striking point is surfing the net increases in the noughties. So does reading in the noughties as well. Watching TV declines though, however, so that's an interesting development. The 80s is very different to they're each very different. The 90s, we have a drop in reading, we have an increase in watching TV, and an increase in theatre. So there's lots going on here. So we want to think about, okay, how are we going to, again, we've got this grouping problem to solve. How are we going to group them together? So we have an odd number, 3 different decades. You could also group them with these variables here if you wanted to. I think time is a bit of an easier way to split up the data. It's nice you can talk about things changing over time. But it's up to you, however you feel is the groups work best. I'm going to go for the decades, and I think I'm going to perhaps talk about the 80s in 1980s, and then group the 90s and the noughties together. But really, you can do it however you want to. There's no real right or wrong here. You can see what works best for you. Okay, so our plan, very important piece of paper to help us in the arts exam here. Okay, so group 1, we're going to discuss the 1980s. Oh, not the 1890s, the 1980s. And what's happening there? Most things are on the increase in the 1980s. Yeah, most things are on the increase, and most things are on the increase in the 2000s, the 90s. Oh yeah, most things increase. Okay, so that could be good observations for our overview then. Yeah, okay. Let's think about group 2 then. We'll do the 1990s and we'll look at the 2000s, or the noughties, which is it's commonly referred to, and we'll group them together and just pick the main features there. Okay, so then let's have a think. There was a bit of a drop in the 80s and 90s in doing activities in free time. Let's see. By the end of the noughties, most leisure activities had seen a rise in percentage of elderly people spending time doing them. Let's talk about that. So by the end of the 2000s, or by 2010, actually, that's easier. By 2010, most activities most leisure activities had seen a rise in the amount that elderly people were participating. So they were taking part in more leisure activities. They were going hiking more. They were surfing the net more, reading more than they were in the 1980s. The only figure that doesn't follow that is the theatre. That's actually lower, but we can talk about that in more detail in the write-up. Okay then, so that is our overview. Let's go to our write-up here and we can put our answer in the box there. So we've got our task. We've also got this nice these words which are really useful for things like decrease, increase, stay the same, and adverbs as well. So when we use those in sentences, it creates a really strong essay. Right, okay then. So let's start, as always, by paraphrasing this first line. The graph below shows, we could say the line graph, we could be more specific, provides data on how elderly people, maybe how older members of society spent their free time, how older members of society, or maybe what older members of society did for leisure, between the years 1890 between 1980 and 2010. Okay, let's read this back. The line graph provides data on what older members of society did for leisure between the years 1980 and 2010. In general, that's a nice way to open this up. In general, this or these individuals every activity increased. Well, most apart from theatre, but the other ones increased. So we want to say these individuals allocated more time than for most of the activities by 2010 in comparison to at the start of 1980. In general, these individuals allocated more time for most of the activities by 2010 in comparison to 1980. We can always talk about how theatre wasn't quite as high. However, the theatre did not have however, the people attending the theatre had dropped in 2010 had dropped over the, we can maybe say over the 30 years. Again, not being specific, just very general here. So, however, the people attending the theatre had dropped over the 30 years. So it dropped, then it rose again, but it never maintained what it was in 1980. Okay then, so let's start with the 1980 decade, and we can go into detail now in our first body. Okay, so we can have a nice sort of opening. Time outside of work was taken up with a variety of activities, perhaps. That's quite a nice way to start this. And in the 1980s, older people were spending more time on what were they doing? Oh, watching TV, and maybe hiking or reading, perhaps. And in the 1980s, older people were spending more time or were spending more time in watching TV and reading, perhaps. Okay, so they were on the increase. Let's go into some detail now. We could draw upon the hiking actually. So hiking saw a significant, we're using words from here, significant rise during this decade. At the start, 20% of maybe elders were out walking. Or of the elderly were out walking. But by the end, this figure had doubled. So again, we don't always need to be specific. We can allude to it by saying things like that. This figure had doubled. Brilliant. Okay. So then let's have a look, and we can state that this kept the same trajectory throughout. This hobby increased by 20% each decade. 20% each decade. In fact, I quite like in fact. In fact, this hobby increased by 20% each decade. Okay, so we're drawing some information from the 1980s. Let's also, maybe we can draw upon reading as well. Reading also rose in popularity. Increasing by 10% at the end of the 1980s. Okay, should we have a read of this and see how it's going? Time outside of work was taken up with a variety of activities, and in the 1980s, older people were investing more time in watching TV and reading. Hiking saw a significant rise during this decade. At the start, 20% of the elderly were out walking, but by the end, this figure had doubled. In fact, this hobby increased by 20% each decade. Reading also rose in popularity, increasing by 10% at the end of the 1980s. Okay, I think that's a solid start there. So let's make a start on our next group, which is going to be the 90s and the noughties. Okay, so the 90s saw some different things happening. So we can maybe say there are several different trends in the 1990s. We can say on the other hand. What was happening? The theatre that was declining in the 80s was now rising. The theatre that was on the decline in the previous decade was now climbing. And grew by 10%. What else is happening? And then reading really dramatically fell, actually, so we could talk about that. So we could say the opposite phenomenon. So the opposite was happening. The opposite phenomenon was happening with reading. And what happened there? Oh, we halved. So we could say which plummeted. That's a good word. By half, falling to 20%. Okay, any significant, anything else significantly happening? Or maybe we could go into the noughties now, because we're always looking at time and thinking how we can make sure we can write everything at our best capabilities here. So how about we start with the 2000s? Saw, significantly a spike in numbers for surfing the net, and reading. Wow, that was on the rise again. And then we could talk about their numbers in 2010. So by 2010, what was surfing the net was at 50%, and reading was at 60%. And I like this word, respectively. So surfing the net by 2010, 50% and 60% respectively. Okay. Anything else that was happening? So everything was on the rise. The only activity that saw a drop was watching TV. This fell to 65%. However, or even so, this was still higher than in 1980. Okay then, let's have a read back and see how it sounds. There are several different trends in the 1990s on the other hand. The theatre that was on the decline in the previous decade was now climbing and grew by 10%. The opposite phenomenon was happening with reading, which plummeted by half, falling to 20%. The 2000s saw a spike in numbers for surfing the net and reading, by 2010, 50% and 60% respectively. The only activity that witnessed a drop was watching TV. This fell to 65%. Even so, this was still higher than in 1980. Okay, so you can see how, if it wasn't for the time, we could carry on, but we're really, a skill here is to really pick the most important parts of this line graph that we have today and report back on it. And that's what we've done. Okay, let's have a think about, we'll just double check the numbers and see how we're doing. Okay, so that has reached 212 words, which of course is over the 150 word minimum here, but I think it's still a reachable amount, and at least you've seen how we've structured the essay today, so you can go ahead and you could pick your own information out if you're following along. And yeah, hopefully this has been really helpful for you in how to structure these types of essays. Line graphs and the bar charts that we did before, they're really common types of charts and graphs that come up. So really great practice today. Thank you for coming along. Let us know if you've got any questions. As always, we love to hear from you, and we will see you next time.